I notice our panelists are still
Does that make sense?
comparing notes, but why don't we get started? My name is Sam Fankhauser. I'm co-director of the Grantham Research Institute here at LSE, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here to this book launch, the launch of a book that looks vaguely like this. In case you haven't seen it, we have a nice cover that has two clouds on it, one which looks a little bit like the UK, the other one looks like the French coast. You can make of that what you want, but that's the cover we have. The book is about the economics of climate resilient development, and I think it's the first book I've written for about 20 years, or done as an edited book for about 20 years. I don't know about Tom McDermott, my partner in crime. If it's 20 years in his case, it will have been a children's book. But anyway, we thought these things are so rare that we should mark them. So we hold this little launch event here this afternoon. The reason why we've written this book is we've been working on economics of adaptation, economics of climate resilience for many years, and there are a lot of sort of thoughts, ideas, papers, book chapters, things floating around that were sort of crying out to be pulled together. And then we had an opportunity to pull them together when we got a grant from IDRC, the International Development Research Centre in Canada, who invited us to do some work on the economics of adaptation. And we took this opportunity to bring those various pieces of work together, and it isn't just from this particular project. There's work in the book that has been sponsored by DFID. There's work in there that comes from the World Bank, and a lot of work that comes from another IDRC project called PREES, which is Pathways for Resilience in Semi-Arid Economies. So a lot of different strands coming together in this book, and it's just good to finally have had a chance to bring these things together. The plan of today is reasonably straightforward. I will say a few words to introduce the book and give you a bit of a flavor of what's in it and how it looks. But the main attraction is the 5 people you see sitting here, 4 of whom are authors of book chapters, and so they will have a panel discussion between them, led by Eva Lüdi, the PI of the PREES project. So that's the main attraction. That's where the substance is. That's where the questions have to be directed at. I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview before we get started. For those of you who are interested in the book rather than the drinks that follow afterwards, there's a stand out there which Rachel Downey from Edward Elgar, our publisher, has equipped with 2 things. One is copies of the book, so you can open it and browse, see what's in them. There are also flyers there in case you want to order a copy. So all of those good things can happen outside at the sort of the drinks phase of the afternoon. But let me sort of give you a little bit of a flavor then before we get into the substance of the book. It has an overarching theme, or it had one when we started. It got a bit blurred as we went along. The overarching theme is that we thought adaptation to climate change has always been, or for a long time, been a more sort of microeconomic discipline. It's always been a lot about project-level measures, how we build a seawall, how we do flood protection. And a lot of these things are self-contained, they're particularly targeted at climate change, and they lack, in a sense, the bigger picture. And what we sort of felt where the discussion was moving, certainly amongst practitioners, many of you are in that sort of camp, was that we moved from that micro picture to a more macro picture, to an economy-wide picture Sometimes we call it the macroeconomic pictures. I feel that's a slight misnomer because we don't talk about macroeconomic aggregates in the sense of the economic discipline, but we do talk about an aggregate story where we ask what is the link between climate change and economic development and development strategies. So rather than talking about building a seawall or a flood protection scheme, we ask the broader question of how does one incorporate climate and climate change into bigger things like rural development or urban development. When development planners think about their agricultural strategy, whether they should move into new crops, or when urban planners think about further developments, whether they should build houses in particular areas along coastlines or in floodplains. Those are sort of more bigger aggregate macroeconomic decisions, and it's at those decisions that a lot of adaptation has to happen, and that was the idea of the book, to tell the story about that aggregate picture as well. Having said that, if you open up the book, you will find a hell of a lot of microeconomics in it as well. That's why I say the things got a little bit blurred as we went along. To give you a sense of what's in the book, let me quickly give you the table of content. I hope you can read the bottom bit as well, or maybe that's in Sean's on Sean's forehead. But
big enough.
I'm not commenting on that. The book has two parts. The first part is more about concepts, the concept of climate resilient development. The second part is more about specific actions that can be taken. This conceptual part, you see the chapters here. The first one is just an introduction that gives the overview by Tom and myself. And then the first couple of chapters are more about the impacts of climate or of climate change on development, both generically, and we do that not just again at the micro level, but we also look at bigger stories of geography, of institutions, of conflict, and how these things interact with climate. The person to quiz about that will be Tom when the Q&A starts. Then I have a specific chapter on poverty, which was written by colleagues at the World Bank. We then move more into the reverse, if you will, and ask what does development do to climate vulnerability, and what the strategies are to reduce that vulnerability, both generically, but then also in terms of the development or the response options that we have. So that's part one, and as I said, there's Tom over there who will be able to ask the difficult questions about that, but we also have John Ward on the panel, good colleague and friend from Vivid Economics, who's written a chapter on investment hotspots. So that's the people to look at if you have questions about part one of the book. To give you a little bit of a flavor of the content, I told you before we have that those two directions. We look at how climate change affects economic development, the upward arrow you have over there, but also the other way around with what economic development does on climate change. And that, to many extent, is the more interesting, I guess, and the meatier bit that we have. A couple of lessons that come out of that, some of them you will no doubt already know. A first one is that not all development is good for climate change vulnerability. That's probably obvious to most of you, but there's still a sort of an economics discussion that happens when people say the best way to respond to climate change or to adapt to climate change is simply development. We show in the book that the world is a bit more complicated than that. One thing that is true is that development almost always increases adaptive capacity, so it makes it easier on actors, on firms, on households to deal with the consequences of climate change. That link is pretty clear. So economic development is good for adaptive capacity, but there are other aspects to vulnerability, and not all of them are equally clear. A lot of economic development changes exposure to climate risk, for example. A lot of economic development is along coastlines, and coastlines are at risk. There are demographic trends of urbanization where people move from rural areas into cities. Often they end up in parts of the city that are highly exposed to climate risks, to flooding. And so the net effect of that move might be an increase in exposure and vulnerability. Similarly, you can have situations where development strategies involve productivity gains on the back of, say, just-in-time supply chains, which are hugely vulnerable to interruptions through climate events. Or it might be productivity gains related to higher value crops, and some of those higher value crops might need a lot of water, and again you have a higher vulnerability. So the picture isn't clear, and that's what we try to bring out in this part of the report, and show you by way of examples how these things might work. So that's part one. There's a part two on actions, and that's structured more in terms of actions in particular sectors or along particular activities, climate resilient cities or climate resilient rural areas. We talk about insurance. We talk about migration as well, which is interesting because migration for some people is an adaptation measure, which it clearly is. Retreat or relocation has always been one of the options considered in coastal adaptation, for example. But migration is also, if done badly, a sign of the lack of adaptation. If it's improvised, reactive relocation in response to an extreme event, that's highly stressful and probably a sign of maladaptation. So we look at these things as well. In the second part of the book, the people on the panel who can tell you more about that is Elia Costa, immediately here to my left, who has written about climate resilient cities and is an expert in sort of urban adaptation. She's part of a big project we have here at LSE that looks at these things. Svenja Surmensky at the other end, expert in private adaptation and insurance. So those are the people to quiz about the second half of the book. Again, I'm going to give you a little bit of a taster. This is a chart that isn't actually in the book, but if you work very hard and read Paul Watkins's chapters in particular, you can create this little chart here, and it shows you the early experience with adaptation. It sort of gives you a sense what the benefit-cost ratios might be for particular adaptation measures. The ones to the left are the ones with slightly lower benefit-cost ratios. The one to the right have higher benefit-cost ratios. Just two lessons. I suspect you can't read all these things. The two lessons are A, there's a hell of a lot of beneficial adaptation around. You see to the right ecosystem-based adaptation, probably benefit-cost ratios of 50 to 1. At the climate information, halfway to the right, 36 to 1. So some very, very attractive benefit-cost ratios. The other thing you learn from that chart is the hue of the blue that you see there. The darker it is, the more confident we are about those numbers. And you see it's actually not very dark blue. There's a lot of light blue and a lot of sort of white, which implies that we still have a lot to learn about the economics of individual adaptation measures. So we've written a book, but we haven't answered all the questions. So there's a lot more of research that will continue to happen. Finally, before I hand over to the panel, a couple of people one needs to thank, and we are very grateful to. In particular, I've already mentioned IDRC and PREES, who are the main sponsors, if you will, of most of the chapters in the book, and this is a very good and fruitful relationship we've had. We're obviously very grateful to Edward Elgar, our publisher, who has been really very good to us. And then the other logos you see here are the people who sponsor Tom and I on a sort of a daily basis. In my case, that's the ESRC and the Grantham Foundation. In Tom's case, that is University College Cork. So those are many of the people we are grateful for. There are many, many more, one of whom is out there and you can't see him and he can't hear, but that is Stuart Rogers, who has organized the event here tonight. So that's my words of thanks. Those are my introductions. Let me now hand over to the panel and to Eva Ludi, who is going to chair it. Eva has many things that I appreciate. I've already said that she is the very competent PI of the PRIES program. She's also a fellow Swiss, and she comes from the same corner of Switzerland as I do, so it gives me occasionally the opportunity to speak Swiss German. And we only switch to English when it gets technical and complicated. But let me hand over to Eva and the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. So yes, we're both kind of economic migrants. I hope we are not yet migrants of some climate impact on Switzerland, but definitely the geography of Switzerland and its link to development and economic wealth is actually quite an interesting one and relates back to a lot of questions that were raised in Tom's section about certain factors that drive or shape economic development, whether that's geography, whether that's climatic factor or the institutional plumbing of countries and the relationships and how they are now impacted by climate change impacts. So I was kind of thinking of posing a starter question to each of the chapter authors, which kind of tries to pull out a few of the key aspects covered in those chapters and therefore also give the chapter authors an opportunity to briefly outline what are the main points from their perspective, what they have covered in each chapter, instead of going through asking everyone, can you please summarize what is in your section. But then when reading across, I didn't read everything, but I read most of the sections. I found a number of aspects which were covered in all chapters, more or less. Questions around migration, when is it beneficial, when is it actually increasing vulnerability, the question of government policy, public policy, what role do governments have to play in order to allow people, companies, firms to adapt. So a number of areas which are quite common, and that would then sort of form the second part, which should be much more interactive also among the panel members. And then I think we should sort of in 40 minutes open up to a Q&A session where we would invite everyone here present to ask questions to the panelists. I hope that's all right, and then I would like to kick off immediately with Tom, because I think he has sort of laid a foundation around economic development and climate change impacts, but also sort of the factors which shape a country's economic development opportunities, but also its people's opportunities to participate in economic processes. And as I said, that could be geographic factors, climatic conditions, but also the institutional plumbing. Now, climate change affects all of those, either directly through, for example, damages to infrastructure, damages to vital supply chains, but it can also be indirect impacts on socio-political factors that then shape back again the economic processes and development trajectories. So the key question here, I think, is, there are some factors which are difficult to change. Geography or climatic conditions certainly are. So it is much more around policy, it's much more around institutions that need to adapt if we want to ensure that climate change is not undermining opportunities and prospects for economic development. So very specifically, what do you think actions and policies are required by governments and businesses to reduce the likelihood that climate impacts lead to further poverty and inequality both in terms of economic and political opportunities, but to a much more resilient development outcome in a specific country?
Right, thanks, Eva. So I suppose maybe picking up a little bit on what Sam was saying in introducing the book, one of the things we wanted to do with the book was to look at adaptation to climate change through the lens of development economics. And a big theme in development economics is risk, and how the poor cope with risk and struggle to cope with risk, and the reasons why it's challenging for poorer households to cope with risk. And of course, climate change is all about risk. It's a risk multiplier in the sense of for poorer households, their incomes may be weather dependent, and so they may face greater income volatility due to climate change. And also they may face risks to their household assets, so things being destroyed by more extreme weather events. So thinking about, how do we enable poorer households to cope with that additional risk that they face? Well, one of the reasons the poor struggle to cope with risk is essentially due to financial constraints. So obviously, by definition, poorer households lack their own resources, but they also tend to be shut out of credit markets. They tend to have difficulty accessing credit because they don't have collateral, maybe because of geographic isolation in some cases. They don't have easy access to markets, to formal markets. Maybe because of other forms of inequality or discrimination across gender lines or across ethnic lines. So I think certainly an immediate kind of policy goal might be to attempt to enable or facilitate greater access to credit for poorer households. So when households are financially constrained, they cope with risk in inefficient ways. So ex ante, they might choose low risk but liquid assets. They might choose to hold low risk but liquid assets, and thereby face lower returns on their investments. And ex post, when they suffer a shock to their income, so a poor harvest or whatever it might be, poorer households will cope with that shock, use various mechanisms to cope with that shock, such as selling off household assets, sometimes productive assets, removing children from school and putting them to work instead, or engaging in informal borrowing, which is highly expensive. And those things, while they may represent forms of coping, and one of the chapters that I co-authored is called Coping with Climate Risk, those are forms of coping, but they're forms of coping that lead to ultimately in the longer term worse development outcomes. So I think that's a good example where the aims of economic development and the aims of building resilience to climate change overlap quite strongly in facilitating greater access to credit and financial services, and in general in helping people to cope with risk.
Does that not then also open them up to other risks, including those, if the more you depend on foreign capital sources, credits, etc., if your risk profile is not changing, does that not make you even more vulnerable?
Sure, yeah, and I think that's actually a very good point. It's something we do touch on in the book when we look at things like microcredit schemes, which potentially have a big role to play. But one of the drawbacks there clearly is that if you're borrowing to cover the costs of a shock that is recurrent, so where you're facing a recurrent risk and you're simply borrowing to try and overcome that risk each time without actually building greater productivity or a more sustainable source of income, then that simply leads to greater indebtedness. So I think that's an important point.
You also mentioned in your section sort of the vicious cycle of climate stress, state fragility and conflict, and there has been a long history of sort of the relationship between natural environment, and then the endowments with natural resources and conflict, partly now in the case of climate change mediated through migration, which leads to kind of these chaotic or uncoordinated movements of people. So what would you see there in terms of very specific activities and policy changes that would avoid falling into this kind of vicious circle?
Yeah, so I think that's an important point, that looking at the effects from climate change to economic development, there's obviously the kind of very direct impacts on agricultural productivity, on labour productivity, disease environments, etc. But there's also this perhaps less well understood, at least from the academic literature point of view, indirect effects via things like migration and conflict. And they seem to be particularly, those effects seem to be particularly prevalent and particularly pernicious in cases where states are weak, where they're fragile or failed states, where states are not providing the kind of the basic fundamental public goods, infrastructure, and supports that you expect of a sovereign state. And I suppose the question that you raise kind of comes back again to one of the points that Sam highlighted earlier, that these conflicts related to climate, while we wouldn't necessarily say that climate is causing conflict, it may be a catalyst or an accelerator for existing tensions. And that seems to be the mechanism that seems to be at work there is climate shocks leading to migration, creating tensions, perhaps in the case of rural-urban migration, creating tensions in the urban centres, or creating tensions across geographic space. And so I suppose the policy challenge then is, how do you support migration as a form of adaptation, so that adaptation can be used to benefit those who are moving? And essentially it comes down to, can people move? Are people free to move on their own terms? So can they choose to move in order to take advantage of economic opportunities where they see them? Or can they choose to move when the location they're currently in or the activity that they're currently active in is becoming more risky or less productive? Whereas if it's a case that people are being forced to relocate and not on their own terms, or in some cases where people are being forced to remain behind in situations where they're facing deteriorating economic conditions, worse opportunities, greater risk, that is just as big a policy concern in a sense. So I think it comes down to, can you support people to move on their own terms?
Okay, thank you very much. We touched briefly on the conflict or fragile, weak governance, and that also relates to the question I'm kind of putting over to John, because in his section he was really looking at infrastructure gaps and investment gaps in terms of the role of infrastructure for economic development, and identified 3 countries, Nigeria, Ethiopia and the Democratic Republic of Congo, as key countries which have at the moment the biggest gap in terms of infrastructure for where they are in terms of population, but also area of land that could be irrigated but isn't, etc. But at least 2 of these 3 countries are not really beacons of good governance, if we want to call it that way, which probably will have an impact on why there is such an infrastructure gap, because who wants to invest in these countries? So how do we overcome that problem of having weak governance, having weak systems, institutions that allow infrastructure development to take place, but having a really big requirement for additional infrastructure development in order to support the economic development of these countries?
Sure. Thank you very much, Eva. So, I think this is a really kind of core example of where there is actually a very strong link between what you would want to do as kind of relatively standard, and if you would excuse the term, orthodox development policy, and what you want to do when thinking about climate resilient development. So, as you say, everything that is holding back the development of climate resilient infrastructure in countries like Nigeria, Democratic Republic of Congo, and all the other countries that we identify are factors which are also holding back development more generally in these countries. So the reform packages that you would tend to expect to see in these countries around good governance, around improving the institutional strengthening of independent regulators, of increasing the kind of decision-making skills of public authorities are all going to be things which are kind of going to be absolutely essential for the broader infrastructure development of these countries. I think kind of some of the core questions that kind of come on from that, though, are what, in case that wasn't challenging enough, what are the additional things that need to be thought about or which need to be done in order to encourage the infrastructure misdevelopment in these countries not only to happen, but to be happen and to be financed in a way which is actually climate resilient. And I think kind of one of the really core things which is kind of missing from the kind of the development and adaptation interface at the moment relates to the issues around uncertainty. And so we know that uncertainty is one of the kind of defining challenges around planning for adaptation investment. We all know that there is already climate change, and those climate change impacts are going to become more aggravated in the future. But how do we go about, but what we don't know is precisely how those climate change impacts are going to be felt at a localized level. And we can even get situations where I've done work in Ethiopia in the past where we know there's going to be climate change and we know rainfall patterns are going to change, but one climate model says precipitation is going to increase by 10% and one climate model says precipitation is going to decrease by 10%. And that's a fundamental challenge when thinking about how to do infrastructure investment in these countries. And I think one of the really big gaps that we face kind of from a practitioner point of view is that we have the kind of the academic answer to these questions. The good people at Grantham have done a lot of thinking about how to address these sorts of problems from a very kind of conceptual or quantitative perspective. But go to the field and tell somebody that you want to use robust decision making in order to understand, with Monte Carlo simulations of 200,000 different iterations, and you get a fairly short response. And so thinking about how to take the investment, the tools that academics and the people like the practitioners that have been developed from a relatively conceptual level around investment under uncertainty, and use them as a more practical guide for climate resilient infrastructure decision making is something which I think is kind of where one of the big gaps is moving forward.
Okay, very good. Thanks a lot. Infrastructure investment relates sort of to the whole question of urban development. Another big issue given the level of urbanization already seen today, but also predicted to happen in the future. So you describe, Helia, in your section how cities are both very vulnerable to climate impacts, but at the same time they're also offering greater opportunities for people because of available infrastructure, services, greater and more diverse economic activities. So there is a big pull for a lot of people to move to cities, which is absolutely understandable. It's not just the push out of more rural areas. But the big question then is what is required for urban development to manage those specific risks, while at the same time building on existing opportunities. How do you see future sort of urban development, given that most cities have a history, they are there, they cannot easily be moved out of harm's way. So what is available that would help a city planner to kind of take account of climate risks while at the same time continue with offering opportunities for further economic development?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, as you said, there's a big cities that are at the center of the climate problem. They're more vulnerable to climate change. First, because they're 2/3 of all cities are situated in the coastal lines. Cities also have, well, the urban heat island effect is a very good example. Cities are more exposed to heat waves. Because of the amount of sealed surfaces, they also are more exposed to flooding. And at the same time, it's cities that concentrate people, assets, and economic activity. So every time there's a climate impact in a city, the costs are huge. But as you said, it's also cities are also might also bring enormous benefits for the people moving in there. So the main idea is that in order to actually reap the benefits that the cities can offer, you need to take into account climate change. You need to integrate climate change in urban planning. So because of the uncertainty, as you talked about before, there's a lot of uncertainty, and this is especially, in terms of cities, it's even more important because there's uncertainty on climate change, but there's also a huge lack of information in terms of economic data at the city level. So when policymakers are making decisions at the moment, the kind of infrastructures that they implement in the city, the kind of urban spatial planning that they implement in their own cities is going to have lock-in effects. They're going to affect the vulnerability of populations for many centuries to come. One of the important things that we touch upon in our chapter in the book is the need to have coordinated infrastructures and coordinated governance. What does this mean? It means that infrastructures should take into account, like all types of infrastructures should take into account the other types. For example, when you build a development close to a railway, you need to make sure that this development is not going to increase the chances of flooding on a railway. And in terms of coordinated governance, this is one of the major factors for cities, is that you need to have good coordination vertically and horizontally. So vertically, in terms of sharing of information and sharing of resources across economic departments, but also horizontally. So for example, one of the main problems for cities is that a lot of the adaptation projects require huge levels of financing that cities sometimes don't possess. So you need to have support from the national government. And you need to have this level of coordination across levels of governments, but also across economic departments, in order for your decisions, the decisions that you make now, at least, are take into account not only the current needs of the population, but what the future needs of the population will probably be. So, for example, in terms of right now, we see that there's a huge increase of rapid urbanization, and for the growth of the cities at the moment. So what the city is very difficult to change, but cities are still growing. And what happens usually is that you get urban sprawl, and urban sprawl is at the same time hampers the benefits that could happen in cities. First, because it increases commuting costs. So this is already undermining agglomeration economies, which are one of the huge benefits of cities, while at the same time increasing pollution. But in the context of climate change, it has even more negative problems because, for example, the fact that transport is already more costly means that when you have an emergency, the transport costs are going to increase even more. So you should really integrate the need for climate planning into urban planning, so you can have the benefits of urban growth while at the same time protecting against climate.
Thank you very much. Let's move to insurance, a big topic of increasing attraction to a lot of donors, definitely seeing what is happening in specifically also Ethiopia, where I work quite a lot, where people are talking of micro-insurance or other setups. So yes, insurance certainly can help smooth losses and can help actors to cope with disasters once they have happened. And it should also support more strategic and information-based approaches to adaptation and planning. Now, having just come through a major drought in the Horn of Africa, what would insurance help both the farmers directly affected through crop losses, livestock losses, but also governments through the increased costs of providing sort of support and aid to affected populations? What role could insurance play in dealing with the immediate hazards, but then also in terms of thinking around longer-term building resilient systems and structures that would encourage sort of a more forward-looking approach to these recurrent disasters that will affect the Horn of Africa every 5, 6, 7 years in the near future?
Okay, well, many thanks. Yes, it's absolutely right. There is a growing expectation and growing interest that, insurance can play a significant role in supporting low-income countries in their quest to become more climate resilient. In fact, I've just come back from an internal UNFCCC meeting in Manila, where this was the topic, where the idea was, how can we define the role of risk transfer instruments going forward, and how that should be recognized in a global climate change structure. So there is growing interest and expectation. I think that's also based in our experience from a sort of disaster point of view, where actually insurance can help to move away from this sort of persistent reactionary approach, relying on post-disaster payouts, and can try and move a country or individuals or businesses to a sort of ex-ante risk-based understanding, planning, and sort of almost preparing for the unexpected. So that's kind of the whole attraction around insurance. And yes, there is evidence that it can do that in many ways. It can do that often in the context of disasters, of extreme events. It's sort of less well tested in what we call the slow onset sort of long-term developments. And, we can come back to that point later on. But I think what's really important in this whole discussion is to understand, this sudden interest, or this interest or expectation that insurance can play a role is often, in my mind, sort of misguided, in that a lot of people think that it is a tool that can be applied on an almost standalone basis, that you can go into a country such as Ethiopia and come up with an insurance tool and that will do the job. So you provide a farmer with insurance, and yes, they might get a payout, and then they can carry on farming the way they've always farmed, and next time something happens they might get another payout. That in itself is obviously a very sort of short-term view, and that has also proved to be actually quite detrimental, because it could create a huge sort of reliance on this instrument. It can also basically be a big disincentive to do anything else. So you have insurance, so you don't do anything else. And that actually has happened when you look at the sort of country level, where countries have sort of taken out insurance. And there are schemes, for example, in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, now also in Africa, where governments pool together and try and come up, together with almost like a pool insurance. And again, the risk there is you start relying on insurance and you ignore all the other instruments and tools that are actually required to try and address the underlying problems and try and address rising risks and become more resilient. Because on the face of it, insurance is a tool that helps you to cope financially with something. I mean, it's the same with us here with home insurance and car insurance. It doesn't just on the base of it, it doesn't do anything to the underlying risk. You can design it in a way that it can then help you to, change your behavior. You can implement it in a way that it convinces governments to take more, sort of proactive preparedness steps. And, I'll just give you one example. There's this new scheme called the African Risk Capacity. And our government, DIVID, has significantly sort of supported that and funded that. And the idea is actually that, and this is sort of in response to the drought question, that it sort of creates a contingency facility. So a lot of countries pool together, they pay a premium, and there's a pot of money. And if there is the first indication of a drought hitting a particular region, they get, on hitting that sort of first trigger, the first indication, they get a payout that is supposed to then help them to respond straight away and reduce the sort of prolonged economic impacts that drought might have if you wait for, let's say, 6 months till the first aid money comes in. So the idea there is really, to speed up the process, to use this money to actually be proactive, help local farmers, kickstart some sort of processes that will actually reduce the impact of a drought. And, you know, that has worked so far. It has, I think, in a couple of countries they have paid out, and they've reduced the time that a country received money to deal with droughts by around 6 months. So that's a good example. The problem is, will this then also help you, you know, in terms of adaptation and in terms of addressing the underlying risks? And in this case, they actually have a condition for any government to join this scheme. They have to submit it's called a contingency plan, but the idea is also to have a, you know, contingency/adaptation plan. So the government needs to outline, you know, how they expect to be able to cope with future drought risk, and how the payouts that they receive will not just sort of cover the losses, but also increase resilience. And I think that's a very important point. And there are other examples where this is tested in Ethiopia, where farmers, in order to get access to insurance, have to participate in some community flood protection work. So you basically earn your right to get insurance by participating in some work. So there are some interesting examples, but my message is that by and large, if you look around, insurance is only actually really used as a, you know, financial risk transfer element. And, you know, even in this country, the way we're doing flood insurance, it doesn't really help us to become more resilient. So yes, there is a lot of excitement, a lot of hope that this can play a bigger role in supporting low-income countries. But from my end, also a warning sign that, you know, we're not actually doing that well in implementing it and linking it to other adaptation measures. If we manage to do that, then I think, you know, insurance can play a big role. Well, let's hope that people will get the message and will follow these positive examples.
Very good, thanks a lot. One topic that has come out from all the four sections or chapters was the issue of lock-in into unsustainable activities, or the danger of maladaptation, whether that is, for example, in terms of urban planning, you do something and then you are stuck with what is being done, and actually people are exposed to higher risks. Infrastructure development very often is a tricky question, particularly in areas where suddenly rainfalls decrease and you have just invested millions in a large irrigation scheme. It can send wrong signals through insurance by saying, oh, well, yes, I'm covered, so I don't have to think about why am I at risk and exposed. Or it can lead to sort of specific, discrete adaptation interventions in areas that are already marginal or economically, or, for example, agriculturally marginal, and where conditions are expected to just deteriorate, and you basically lock in both investments but also people into unsustainable livelihoods in specific areas where there is little action otherwise and little hope to improve in the future. So what is required from your different perspectives to prevent that we get into those lock-in situations, into those maladaptive practices, and where will governments have a role to play to guide the different activities, the different investment decisions by individual people, by investors, but also by city governments, to prevent that we end up in such lock-in maladaptive situations, but that the right investments are being made.
I might take that one first if I could.
Easy question, easy. Just
So yeah, I think that was a theme that we were keen would come out in the book, is this idea of maladaptation and lock-in. And as we saw it, a lot of existing literature and existing focus in adaptation to climate change is on protecting existing forms of production, protecting locations where people currently are, protecting livelihoods as they're currently constituted. And I suppose there is a danger there, certainly in cases where those activities and those locations are already marginal from an environmental perspective in terms of their sustainability, in terms of their productivity. that in trying to support those activities, so you might be thinking of something like investing in irrigation schemes, or in building a flood defence for a particular part of a city, or anything that supports the existing kind of status quo. There is a danger there that you're supporting an activity that in the long term is actually unsustainable, or that the underlying economic dynamics is pushing towards a point where it becomes unsustainable, or where people prefer to do something else actually in the future. And so there's a danger that by intervening to support an activity that is essentially on its way out, or a location that may in the future be less desirable for whatever reason, that you're creating a kind of maladaptation there. So I think that is a risk that adaptation, the economics of adaptation and adaptation practitioners and government need to be aware of. So there's maybe a sense in which we have argued that one needs to think also about the balance between those forms which we term kind of in situ adaptation, so protecting what it currently exists, versus the kind of more transformational, if you'll excuse the jargon, types of adaptation. So moving people across space or across economic sectors, or moving activity. So we know that climate change is likely to exacerbate conditions in places that are already facing challenging weather patterns. So it's likely that you have a kind of a reinforcing of spatial inequalities. And then maybe a policy question is, well, do you aim to equalize opportunities across space or across people? And you might think, well, automatically it's across people, right? That we care about people more than we care about places. But then at the extreme, there's cases like with cities where they're in coastal areas. We're not just going to abandon all our cities because the risks are rising in those places. So it's not always clear cut that you prioritize moving to a less risky place or a more productive place because some underlying force is changing. So I think we need to recognize maybe as well with our adaptation strategies that as I was talking about earlier, this idea of risk. The aim of adaptation is not to eliminate risk or minimize risk necessarily, because economic development entails a certain amount of risk and maybe even taking on risk. But it's maybe the goal needs to be in facilitating that risk taking, that it's done in a productive way and not locking in long-term risks or unsustainable risks, as we were mentioning earlier, ones that repeat over and over again.
Just a few very quick thoughts from myself. I have three things I guess I would quickly like to mention. The first is, I do think that we are beginning to see explicit climate screening tools being used by international financial institutions and development partners, and increasingly in governments, both in developed and developing countries, which are explicitly tackling some of these issues and helping people think about the risks of lock-in. And I'm sure there is a long way for those tools to develop and for them to mature. But if you look at the kind of the development of these decision-making tools over the last few years, then you do see a positive trend. I think the second thing that the risk of maladaptation kind of supports comes back to this idea of building flexibility into infrastructure design, and really does place a strong premium on developing that flexibility and building it into the way in which we design infrastructure. And that then takes us back to the points I was raising earlier about making sure that flexibility, even if it comes at increased cost, is actually valued properly and appropriately by people when they're making fairly fundamental and large-scale capital investments. And then to sound, I guess not a note of caution, but a note of pragmatic realism, I think it's also worth bearing in mind that the discount rates that prevail in a lot of the countries in which we're thinking about do actually tend to be, are typically very high. And in making sure that we are promoting development which is climate resilient, I think it's important not to kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater, and to think that all infrastructure decisions and all decisions that ever have to be made should fully take into account the most spec'd out climate resilient solution. We need to, we're talking about countries which have very acute shortages of capital, and it's as not, if not more important, when thinking about climate resilient development, to ensure that that capital is well used and that we use proper decisions for allocating capital. And sometimes that will mean that actually the original investment decision remains the right one.
Maybe just very briefly, I mean, I think from my experience, as soon as you start talking about adaptation as a standalone approach, I think you're on the wrong track. Because, particularly in developing countries, I mean, you need to sort of embed it in, all the issues that a country is facing, all the challenges that a country is facing. And, an example that was used here is infrastructure. I mean, there's a huge amount of infrastructure that is needed. There's a huge amount of infrastructure that's currently being implemented. And most of that, is not climate resilient because, it hasn't been factored in. But it is addressing a lot of other needs that country, urgent current needs. So I think that's the point. You need to sort of integrate adaptation and then future risk considerations into, whatever new sort of challenge the government is facing. And I think, this word mainstreaming, I mean, we like to use that a lot. But at the end of the day, that's it. When you sit down with a mayor or sort of finance minister in a developing country, I mean, they can give you a list of 10 more urgent topics where they think if I don't address that, I'll either won't be re-elected, or my city will in deep trouble. And you then need to sort of build a case for adaptation or resilience being part of that. And there's this idea of having a positive business case, that adaptation is not a cost but an investment, and there are tools around it, but you just need to sort of use that language, I think, rather than coming with a fancy, well, here is a sort of climate proofing strategy, I think.
Just a short note, I think this is mostly a question of short run versus long run. Mm-hmm. And actually a big question that nobody really has the answer to is where's the tipping point? So you're going to protect, for example, from coastal flooding, you're going to protect this part of your city, but what will be the point when protecting it is actually more costly than just abandoning it? And I've had this conversation with Sam many times. Of course, the time scale of, especially of politicians, it's with the time scale of politicians, it's very difficult to think about issues like climate change. It's even difficult to think about issues that are 20 years, that have a 20-year time scale, much less this. So it's very difficult, and it's very easy to get into this lock-in situation because exactly you have so many urgent needs that how are you going to, like you have a piece of land and that the land is probably in a floodplain, so in a few years you're going to have problems, but at the moment this is where you need to put your people inside the city, so you're not going to take this into account. So it's a very important question at which point it's worse to just put the people in a floodplain or in a future floodplain than to have people in more slums in another part of the city.
I'm kind of looking at the time, whether we've got another question or whether we should open to the public for questions.
Open.
Shall I ask one more? And it's similar, a kind of a topic that has been coming out of all chapters is around migration. And migration can be both a positive driver of change, can allow people to take up opportunities that would not otherwise exist where they were residing before, but it can also be a factor that leads to a lot of problems if not managed. So the question is, from your perspective, what is the role of migration, and where do you see your specific aspect of what you were working on in supporting migration and the remittances it generates to kind of contribute to resilient development? Because I think it's something a lot of people are afraid of kind of going into and addressing, because it's so highly politicized, not just in Europe but very much also across Africa or Asia. But it is certainly something that is going to happen in increasing numbers in the future. So where do you see what needs to be done to make migration a positive factor of resilient development and not something that undermines current attempts to strengthen economies to be more resilient and more equitable?
Okay, I'll take a stab at it again.
Your name is on the book. So
Right.
yeah.
Take some responsibility. Yeah, I think the migration issue is another key one that comes out in several of the chapters, and it's something we kind of, I suppose, grappled with a little bit, thinking about in what sense is migration, as Sam mentioned, a form of adaptation, and in what sense is it a sign of maladaptation or inability, lack of adaptive capacity maybe. And I think, one of the ways that I started thinking about migration is like a new technology, and it's something that people maybe experiment with or need to experiment with in order to learn about how migration can work as a form of adaptation. And maybe it comes back a little bit to the point I was raising earlier on about access to finance and ability to cope with risk, but also ability to take risks. So migration is a risky thing to do. It's also something that has a lot of costs associated with it, and also tends, realistically, the people who do migrate tends to self-select for people who have higher human capital, higher financial capital, because it's a costly thing to do, and so sometimes the people who maybe most need this technology, this form of adaptation, are the very ones that get left behind or that are unable to engage with it. So maybe thinking a bit about what can governments do or policymakers do to support migration as a form of adaptation. Well, certainly, financial support is one, or maybe, whether that's better access to credit or directly financing kind of small scale migration, local migration, or seasonal migration, but also reducing the costs. So basic things like transport infrastructure can have a big bearing on the cost and the ability of people to migrate in search of economic opportunity. There's also information barriers. So, I guess, again, going back to the idea that the challenge of migration is whether or not people can migrate on their own terms. So providing information both to enable local adaptation, that people don't have to migrate. So, supporting local adaptation by providing information on opportunities in the local area, or by providing information on climate patterns, weather patterns, expected climate change, ways of adapting to that, but then also information on what are the opportunities if you do want to migrate. Where can you go? What are the job opportunities in the local city, maybe further afield? And information being a public good, that's clearly a place where governments can intervene and have a positive impact. Another one maybe, and it's a little less obvious, is property rights. And again, it comes back to balancing the local adaptation with the desire to move in order to seek opportunity elsewhere. So by enabling, by facilitating better property rights or enforcing property rights, you allow people to make better investments at home, to plan for the longer term in their local in doing local adaptation. But also maybe again you facilitate that experimenting with migration, because if you don't have secure tenure in your home place, then you'll be unwilling to do seasonal migration or to send a family member away because you may be afraid of your land being expropriated, or the investments that you made at home being damaged while you're gone. So I think there are different levels at which maybe policy can intervene to support good forms of migration, if you like.
Just one very quick thought from myself, linked to Tom's point about the self-selection, and therefore the people who don't self-select and therefore are left behind. And I'm sure many people are aware of the kind of the astounding statistics of the value of the flows of remittances versus values of ODA, with remittances kind of being several multiples larger than ODA flows. And it remains a bit of a surprise to me. We did a little bit of work on this about a year ago, just how little policy attention there has been from a lot of international development agencies around making those flows of remittances making them cost effective and making them efficient. And there's been an awful lot of technology development around things like mobile money and around other kind of financial inclusion activities, which to date don't really seem to have affected the remittance market and flows of remittances very much at all. And I think one part of a policy response around migration as a form of adaptation needs to look quite seriously at how remittance markets can be made to work more effectively.
In terms of urban development?
Well, in terms of urban development, well, a huge problem for cities, as I said before, is that this uncontrolled urban growth can be very detrimental to the city, both in economic terms, but also in terms of how it's going to be affected by climate change. And what happens is, basically with climate change, for example, if you have a drought, this is going to affect all the rural areas, and this is going to increase even more rural to urban migration. So what happens when this is uncontrolled and unplanned is most of these people end up living in slums or in informal settlements in areas that are prone to floods or to landslides and with very little access to infrastructure. So this population is going to end up being very, very vulnerable to any kind of climate shock or even economic shock. So a big problem that is needed is that when you know that the cities are going to grow, probably most cities are going to grow. It's predicted that cities in developing countries are going to grow by 1 billion by 2030. So it's a lot of people going into cities. So it's necessary to have advanced planning. So whether the city has capacity to grow, and if the city has capacity to grow, what's the best way? What kind of urban planning and spatial planning do you need to put? What kind of regulation do you need to put in place? What kind of extra services and infrastructure you're going to need to provide, such that actually moving into from the rural area to an urban area is not going to increase the vulnerability of the population, but decrease it.
Well, I'm not an expert in migration, and as far as I'm informed, you can't really insure against it. Or it would be interesting to see whether those who have insurance are less likely to migrate, but that's another topic. Probably are, but that's then cause and effect is probably some far-fetched. I can just say that in the current discussion, sort of at international level, at the UNFCCC, you know, there is a focus on migration. So from the perspective of, you know, this idea of potentially setting up some compensation funds for countries that will or are likely to experience, you know, a huge sort of resettlement, losing land. I mean, low-lying islands come to mind. Who are sort of saying, well, we either need to buy land somewhere else, or, you know, we need to support people here so that they don't move away and that they can stay here. And, you know, it's a whole sort of social justice discussion, and it's under this headline of loss and damage. It's a very sort of political discussion right now. But interestingly, you know, it's very difficult then to drill down to the climate change component in this. And I'll just give you sort of an anecdote. As part of those current discussions at the UN level, there was sort of a study done in Tuvalu, in the island of Tuvalu, where people who currently live there or who have moved away were interviewed about, you know, their sort of ranking of problems, you know, those who have moved away, what triggered, you know, you moving away. And, you know, it appeared that the whole sort of issues that Tuvalu is facing around, you know, climate risk and, you know, sort of the current impacts that the island is already facing, you know, didn't really feature high on that list. It was more the sort of other direct impacts, you know, people not being able to find a job, you know, following other relatives, you know, not believing that the government will ever do something for them. So it was kind of, you could then probably in turn argue that climate is having an effect on all those things. But in the discussion at the UN, the findings of this study triggered a huge fraud discussion with a lot of sort of representatives from these islands saying, well, you know, that doesn't prove anything. That doesn't prove that climate isn't triggering migration. And on the other hand, you had people saying, look, you know, a lot of these problems are homemade. Don't expect us to, you know, to come up and pay for that. I mean, you know, there's kind of a drastic very, very rough description of what's currently going on. But I think it just highlights, the sort of social justice and fairness questions that are linked to migration and how you actually deal with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just one very quick last question before opening up, and that's around a lot of answers by government people when you talk about development deficits, etc., investment deficits. A lot of time, climate change comes up as the first factor. Yes, the El Nino is a result of climate change, and this is a result of climate change, and poverty in our country is a result of climate change. Climate change is a good, decent way of kind of pushing away all responsibility, and is increasingly used by actors that should actually take on responsibility for policy decision, whether that's businesses, whether that's government. Where do you see the role of climate change versus other factors that have an impact on economic development in Africa, Asia, Latin America? How strong is the climate change, the climate risks versus all the other aspects that drive, that shape development, and where is kind of climate change really used as an easy way out of being responsible for wrong policy decisions?
It's a very good question, and I think you phrased it in a very nice way that didn't point any fingers directly at us. But maybe we also need to take responsibility for putting climate change in the foreground, and that's what we study. That's a function of our own interests. But it is important to think about where does climate change rank in the priorities for development, and maybe I'm not an objective person to make that distinction, but one point I would make is, one of the things we wanted to do with this book was to bring those two fields together, adaptation to climate change and development economics, and to make the case that, a lot of the time, the things that make you more climate resilient are the basics of economic development anyway. So it's basic infrastructure, it's education, health. It's the things that are priorities in any case. And so, maybe shifting the blame onto climate change, or saying that these problems are insurmountable because of climate change, maybe is overlooks that basic fact that that your resilience to climate change is very much dependent on how successful you are at economic development objectives to begin with. And maybe if I could just link that back to a point that came up earlier on about uncertainty. Uncertainty in climate forecasting is a big challenge, and sometimes maybe we kind of see uncertainty in forecasts. So you have rainfall could be up 10% or down 10%, and people kind of throw their hands up and say, well, then we can't do anything. But in reality, a lot of the things we need to be doing, we need to do them anyway. There are benefits to a lot of the investments that need to be made, kind of almost regardless of whether the average rainfall goes up or down by 10%. We know it'll become more volatile, and then therefore we need to become better at handling that. And so a lot of the kind of basic investments that need to be made can almost be done leaving uncertainty to one side in a sense. Sorry, I dragged the question slightly away from where it started.
Question.
Well, I mean, again, the way you phrased it, I mean, I was just thinking, if you would have, I don't know what kind of audience we have here, nobody started, screaming. Or so, but, the way you phrased it, the audience that I'm often sort of in, and also more recently with a lot of, developing country representatives and people sort of from the social climate justice side. I mean, they argue that, here is a clear responsibility, and, they sort of focus on the climate component almost as a given. I mean, that then leads to the question, to what extent can you actually single that out? Can we use attribution to actually come to some sort of agreement, which then becomes, a really sort of fraught area. But on the other hand, you then have the idea that you have to look at all these issues in a, holistic way. I mean, this whole idea of merging disaster, risk management, development, and adaptation is this idea that you can't actually single out the individual drivers and that you have to look at it comprehensively. And I think a lot of people buy into that up to the point where you say, but hold on a moment, someone has to be blamed for this in a way. And there is the question of compensation at some point. And I think that's where currently, when you look at the political discussion sort of at a global level, that's sort of where it is. It's that one point where it's, at the end of the day, you know, there is a blame and, you know, there is something that the North did to the South in a way. And, you know, that's where it becomes then
And I think
tricky.
in that sense, it's really, climate change is perhaps almost a lightning rod for much broader and more philosophical differences in perceptions of development and drivers of development. And so, I mean, you asked the question in the context of climate change, but I think the response requires, you know, a much broader conception of how you think countries develop and what are the drivers of development.
I have basically no experience speaking to policymakers, but I have a feeling that, I mean, why should climate be different than any kind of external factor? I mean, a country might be affected by climate change, but it might be affected by other kinds of shocks, financial shocks from another country. Or you talked about uncertainty. It's almost impossible. It's very difficult to predict inflation, but that doesn't mean that countries don't have mechanisms in place exactly to protect against hyperinflation, or the ECB is a really good example of this. So I don't think that the fact that it is climate change should take away responsibility from governments to protect against that.
Great, thank you very much. Over to the audience.
The not screaming audience.
Yeah, well, it's just coming.
Jeff Beacon from the Solutions Act Association. My reading of the IPCC and extra is that the remaining carbon. My reading of the IPCC and others is the remaining carbon budget is so small, and we've just got to have a cut in world GDP because we just cannot decarbonise enough. And Oxfam tells us that the top 10% of the wealthy produce 50% of the pollution. The bottom 10% produce hardly any at all. So if we can ignore country barriers for a moment, difficult, if we were to tax pollution at a sensible level, we'd just have so much dosh, we could share it out in the world and have a very different sort of environment. Now, adaptation in this context will be different. We wouldn't be building cities like the one that the LSE is building out there with the enormous embodied carbon, because the embodied carbon for a decent place in a city, the way it's done at the moment, is swamps the carbon budget in one go, and there's none left. So I want to know if the panel are more optimistic than the stuff I've read, and produced a different conclusion to the size of the carbon budget, and whether the only alternative is a completely different approach to world economics, and adapting to new ways of life which don't include flying, driving too many cars, or eating beef.
Who can I invite to try and answer that big philosophical question? Is there another form of economic development?
I mean, to answer the question in two parts, in terms of kind of the trajectory that the world is on at the moment, I think most of the reading of the kind of the optimistic views of where we might be going in terms of emission reductions, etc., would indeed point to a world of warming greater than 1.5, certainly greater than 1.5 degrees, and almost certainly. I mean, I think the more optimistic scenarios would probably around about 3 degrees. Now, obviously, there's quite a lot of uncertainty around that, and that's one of the challenges for policymakers on mitigation and on adaptation. I think what I would say is I would be less. I can't think of a right adjective, but I would be less. Less. I would view that there are opportunities for reducing emissions without having to have a catastrophic reduction in living standards. And
eating beef doesn't cost me anything.
I'm not.
Not eating beef.
Yes,
not
no.
flying
So
does.
that's exactly. So I
don't
think.
like driving in cars anyway.
I'm very pleased to hear it. But there are, so in that sense, I think what has become increasingly clear over the last 3, 4, 5 years is that there are ways of reducing emissions and moving us closer towards a 1.5, 2 degree, well, 2 degrees at least, scenario, which wouldn't involve significant sacrifices in terms of standards of living.
Although there would be a cut in GDP, wouldn't there?
Well,
Stopping flying is a cut in GDP. And stopping crashing your car is a cut in GDP.
And so we could get into a long discussion as to whether we want to measure welfare in terms of levels of GDP. And I certainly think that most of the studies suggest that significant climate mitigation could be achieved with a, at best, at worst, modest reduction in GDP.
Neil Walmsley from C40. We're an association of the mayors of the world's largest megacities focusing on tackling climate change. We've been trying to help our cities in developing countries find investment for their low carbon and climate resilient infrastructure. So larger scale projects of perhaps over $50 to $100 million in size minimum. We ran a program on credit worthiness with the World Bank for the last year to address the issue of cities not having a credit rating, be able to access capital for their programs, and it was not the best success when we realized exactly how difficult it was to do this, even with relatively well-resourced megacities. Though one thing we did see, we saw a few different innovations that seem to be have a bit more potential, and one of these was around climate smart capital investment planning at the city level, so longer term planning processes which essentially screens these projects at a much earlier stage of concept to see what the climate, well, both the mitigation but also the adaptation components would be. So if you're building a hospital in, let's say, Kampala, Kampala's where this was being tested out quite successfully, is the reason the land is so cheap to build a hospital there because it floods every year? Which are the sorts of questions they won't normally ask until they've started building it and they notice that. And they seem to see that seems to be quite effective there. But Kampala is a very well-resourced city because it's getting a lot of funding from World Bank to test out these projects. In Dar es Salaam and other cities where they've also tried to do that and haven't had the same level of backing, it's not been quite so effective. So my question really is around whether things like climate smart capital investment planning and other mechanisms similar to that might be an effective approach for in the development space for cities.
Well, I'm not familiar actually with the climate smart capital investment planning, but right now there are a few instruments in place. One of them, we also mentioned in the chapter, is the credit worthiness index that you created. Of course, all of them, they have pros and cons depending on the situation, on the specific setting of each city. So for example, land value capture, it's very good at targeting the benefits for the people that actually make the investment. Public-private partnerships have had a lot of success in cities in developed countries. This type of climate smart capital investment planning, I have a feeling that it will work if there is information. And a big problem in developing countries, cities, is that there's a huge lack of information at all levels, not just on climate change that everybody has, but lack of information even about lack of data, lack of indicators on the city, on the economic structure, on the demographic structure. Sometimes there's a lack of information about construction materials, and so I guess that it would be a good. I mean, I think an instrument like this could be potentially a very good instrument. It just has to be coupled with a lot of information, which might come from the local level if there's a little bit more effort on exchange of information, but it might have to come from the national or even international level, because cities many times just don't have the capacity. Many cities don't even have enough, they don't produce enough knowledge from universities, and when they do, they don't have very good mechanisms to disseminate it. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Helena Wright. I work for the government on the International Climate Fund. I just wanted to come back to the slides, and I was really interested in the slide which had the benefit-cost ratio on it. And I was just interested in the fact that ecosystem-based adaptation had really high benefit-cost ratios. And I was just wondering, what are the kind of implications for climate finance that came out of the book? And also, do you know about any studies about the benefit-cost ratio of adaptation and mitigation together, and whether there's been much kind of studies on that area? Thanks.
I think Sam must answer that. It was your slide.
It was my slide, but it wasn't actually my analysis. It was Paul Watkins's. Implications for climate finance of all this. There isn't. We talked long and hard, Tom and I, whether we needed a climate finance chapter in it, and in the end, it never quite happened. John is actually an expert in climate finance, just in brackets. Adaptation is obviously, up there in the climate finance discussion. The questions are, where does the how much does adaptation cost? And I think the answer is we don't know. There's a bunch of studies that have tried to look at that, none of which I have full confidence in. What they tell us that is reasonably robust is that it costs more than the public money that's currently available. We also know that adaptation isn't just about public money. I mean, that's true for mitigation as well, but it's true for adaptation as well. There's a lot of adaptation that it's privately financed, and often it's hidden. You don't know that you have undertaken adaptation finance. You just happen to make a smart investment decision that takes the context into account. So, a lot of adaptation expenditure we don't actually know about. Are there examples of mitigation and adaptation co-benefits? I can't think of too many. People start looking at sectors where those things come together, which is agriculture, which is buildings, which is energy. But if you ask me what the benefit-cost ratio of these things is, I'm not sure I know.
Hello, my name is Adrian Fenton. I work for the Centre for Climate Change Economics and Policy. So I have a question about the book more in general, rather than a specific question for one of the panel members. My question was, to what extent does your book discuss or explore justice and ethical issues within climate resilience development? For example, you have a chapter on climate resilient urban development. We know that urban centres often display various levels of poverty, where you can have the extreme wealthy living next to the extreme poor. How do we achieve climate resilience for all within each of the chapters? I was just wondering whether that was covered.
You want me to take that one, do you?
I can, but you're near the microphone.
So we don't have an explicit chapter on climate justice and ethics, and we were coming at this from a kind of economics background, and maybe we have blind spots to a certain extent around ethical debates. But there is a sense in which we do talk about inequality and the unequal impacts of expected unequal impacts of climate change, and how we expect climate change to exacerbate existing inequalities. And I was talking a little bit earlier about the inequality across space, and how we can expect places that are already marginal or risky or low productivity to suffer worse effects from climate change. We do also touch on the some themes of gender and other forms of exclusion or discrimination and how they relate to climate resilience. But yeah, I think it appears in elements of the book without being a theme that we've really drawn out.
The only thing I would add, there is a chapter on climate change and poverty written by colleagues from the World Bank where these things come out a bit more strongly in some of the chapters. Tom is absolutely right, there's a bit implicit.
Hi, I guess this is one for John Ward. You said we need to convert academic answers to practical ideas, and I was just wondering if you'd thought about sort of any mechanisms for that.
Just be careful what you say. Well, as a consultant, you'll have to pay. I think we are beginning to see the emergence of these kind of heuristics which allow us to take the academic work around decision making under uncertainty and apply it in developing country contexts. And I've seen some recent work which has been done, some of it from an adaptation perspective in countries like the Philippines, where people are trying to use some of the existing modelling tools that exist in these countries and use some of the existing planning tools. And some of it starts with relatively simple what if scenarios and running lots of different scenarios, and then kind of saying what is a consistently good investment strategy across 5, 6, 7 different sorts of scenarios. And we are beginning to see that sort of idea kind of filter out into the decision making that countries are making. I've seen some efforts which are being made at perhaps you might call it slightly more sophisticated, but also slightly more information heavy approaches around things like robust decision making, which are definitely being used in some countries. So I think we are beginning to see that sort of emergent of those ideas, but I think there's still quite a long way to go.
Maybe just very briefly, I mean, what I experienced that in a lot of developing countries, actually the connection between, the sort of science community or academic community in those countries, however small it might be, and the government decision makers is often much smaller than it is here, if I dare say that, because, I've come across many cases where it's actually the same person, it's someone who's conducting the science around, leading a research project, but at the same time as part of the delegation or even a negotiator at a UN level. And, I think there is potential, to then sort of through that to have a more sort of, science-based policy making.
Thank you very much.
Okay, at that point, it's up to me to do 2 things. The first is to convince you not just to run away and go home, because there are drinks next door. If you have time to stay for a chat and continued discussion, please do so. Again, just next door, hard to miss. Follow the trail, follow the crowd. The other thing I want to do is to thank all the panelists. They have been fantastic chapter authors and co-editors over the last year or so, and tonight I think they have been really good panelists sharing their insights and their wisdom on climate resilient development. And of course Eva has been a fantastic chair. The beauty of having a Swiss chair is that you finish on time. So thank you all, and hope I see you next time.
I spent
Too much time in the UK.